Well, thank you, men. As Brian said, my name's Brian Crenshaw. I'm the other Brian. A little bit about me. I'm the student pastor, like Brian mentioned. We came here from Nashville to help plant Fellowship. We were part of that original 26 and was not working at Fellowship at the time. Was working in the Binghamton neighborhood. Came on staff full-time about 10 years ago and have worked with students and families ever since. And a little bit of my journey, growing up in a home, a small town where I did not really have a lot of models in our community of what manhood is. Like for me, going to church, the men sat outside before the sermon and smoked. I grew up in a country church, about 30 people. So every man in my life smoked other than my dad when I was growing up. So that was kind of my picture. They were all silent and did not express themselves very much. So kind of grew up. I see this baseball bat up here. I'm a baseball guy as well. And I was telling someone not too long ago that manhood for me feels a lot like that Dominican kid that has to fashion a glove out of like a cardboard box. Like he just wants to play ball. He doesn't have the equipment, but he fashions what he has and what he can get his hands on to make it happen. For me, manhood in a lot of ways was that growing up and even today somewhat feeling like I have that desire to lead, to be a man, to pass it on to others, but at times feel like I've just got a cardboard box instead of a Rawlings, nice gloves. So for you guys today, I want to pass on to you a little bit of what that journey looked like for me. I want to show you, walk you through this cycle. And then Brian's going to come up. We're like the Moon Dogs, ultimate tag team. He's going to slap his hand. He's going to come in and finish it out. So for me, this journey, as I got into high school, middle school, the manhood journey for me revolved a lot around sports. It may have with a lot of you guys, but that's where I felt like I saw some models, was pressed and trained and taught in some ways. And then when that athletic scene got removed, as I entered college, there was like this hole, like, okay, that was not complete, even though it filled that void for a time. And so once I was in college, I started to really look at what does it mean to be a man. And thankfully was plugged into a great church, ended up at a great church after graduation in Knoxville, moved over to Nashville, and got plugged in with a guy named Jeff Schulte, who some of you are familiar with. And as I went through that process, really we met about, I think it was like 45 weeks of this throughout the year. And at the end, I remember we went through this whole long process, and at the end we got like this keychain. I was like, man, we just gave 45 weeks of learning manhood and all this, and then we got a keychain. And so it just kind of felt like we got to the end zone and we fumbled. So a lot of my manhood training was always wanting a little bit more and feeling like it's always a little bit incomplete. And Jeff's teaching was great. That whole process was great. It really built me. But I tell people, like, I became an adult at 18, I guess, but didn't become a man until I was 25. And I had a specific time in my life that I felt like that I became a man. So I want to pose this question before we get into the cycle, a rhetorical question for you just to think about for a second. At what point in life do you feel like you became a man? Was there a set point in time? And if so, when was that? And if you'd asked me that question when I was 22, 23, 24, even though I would have facial hair and be an adult in society, I would have answered, well, I'm not yet. And so some in this room may be feeling like that. Well, I'm not, or I have those yearnings, I have those desires, but I don't really have a clear pathway, or I've never been affirmed in that. So I want to show you the cycle that I think is very important for us. We walk through this in our student ministry with some of our dads. And actually, this started to develop because I would share it with some students, and then we would look at our volunteer leaders that were in their late 20s, and they would say, man, I've never had that, or I'm here on that cycle, and I'm wrestling with that. And so we started to walk through this with adult men. So I thought, well, this isn't just applicable for a 7th grader. Let's talk about this with some 20s and 30s and 40, 50 and up. Well, this cycle, let me give you a little background on it. We, through some of that research, got plugged in with the book called From Boys to Men, Spiritual Rites of Passage. in an Indulgent Age. It's by a guy named Brett Stevenson. And if you ever want to geek out and really dive deep into some of the stuff we're going to talk about today, we can get you a copy of this. He's a counselor, psychologist, and it's definitely a little bit more clinical. But I got my hands on this book, and I thought, man, this is the first model that I've seen that really walks you through the process. It felt like there were a lot of terms. I grew up in the men's fraternity, which is what 33 turned into, the 4 pillars of manhood, and those were great, very foundational. But this was where I could scan back and see the cycle of what a man would go through in his life. And so what Brett had done with some others, it had looked at a lot of primitive tribes over a lot of different generations, a lot of different countries that were not interconnected, and found basically some common things that every tribe had shared in its manhood process. And a lot of these tribes in the primitive world, manhood is essential, and it's very calculated on how they develop their men because they need to do that for survival. Whether it's battle, whether it's just finding food, but they usher their men into manhood very systematically. So this model is not a Christian model per se. This guy's not a Christian author. We've adapted it some to fit our church model. But let's walk through that and start that today. So if you can't see the screen, just do your best and we can go from there. But the first stage that everyone starts in is boyhood slumber. And that sounds a little bit weak or a little bit demeaning, and I don't mean it that way. It's just think about your boyhood. Think about up until you're about 12. Really, I think about my son who's 14 now. And 2-3 years ago, the thing he cared most about was what am I going to eat for breakfast? Do we have Lucky Charms? Did that run out? Am I going to get to play video games after school? Did I get my homework done? And so a lot of his world revolves around himself, but he does not really have the capacity to think about the world outside of our home. So he's not thinking about North Korea and nuclear threats. He's not thinking about infant mortality in Memphis. He's not thinking about the problems in our society racially as much. So there's things that we're trying to work with him on to alert him to some of these things and awaken him to that. But the boyhood slumber phase, where everyone starts, is really about play. It's about innocence. It is about need. It's a lack of an awareness of just foundational society things that are critical. And so it's not a negative stage. It's actually a beautiful stage where, and it's an important stage. The reason why is as a boy, some of you all had that boyhood ripped from you. You had to leave this stage too quick. You did not get the play. You did not get the right developmental things in this. And that's why, as maybe a 40-year-old, you really just want to play. That's why you see men that maybe didn't have this. A really extreme example would be Michael Jackson. When you hear his story, his dad kind of ripped him from this because of his music, and he was forced into an adult world too quick, and his dad was very hard on him. And so whenever he gets down in age, he builds Neverland or whatever it's called, and builds a playground in his house because he was missing this stage. And so you can start to see how people dysfunctionally can go off the deep end when they don't have an appropriate boyhood stage. And so the thing for men is that we want to appreciate this stage. I look back on my childhood and look at fond things, but I don't want to continue to live in that stage, and I don't want to continue to live in the past. I want to move out of that stage in a healthy way. So I treasure things from my past, from my boyhood, but I don't hold to them too tight because I've moved out of that stage. But boyhood slumber, what's interesting is usually when boys come out of that stage, there's multiple things that call them out of that stage. It's just called the call to adventure is the next part of the cycle. So I want you all to think about, in your life, what was the first time that your manhood started to awaken? And I'm not talking about the first time that you felt urges towards the opposite sex. I'm not talking about the first time that you wanted to go out into the woods or something like that. But just what did for you guys, what really awakened you out of that boyhood? And for me, there's a couple things. I remember coming back from a summer, had like a back to school dance. I was 6th grade, and it's the first time I slow danced with a girl, and that girl had probably gone through puberty that summer, and I'm like, wow, this is different than hugging my sister or whatever. And so you start to be awakened to things. So a girl is some of the first things that call you out of that stage for some. There's also travel experiences that can call you out of that. A great trip. That's what we really try to encourage our fathers to do with sons, because that's a great thing, to where your worldview is expanded. Also, this stage, the call to adventure, it's not always positive. Sometimes tragedies can send you out of this stage, a loss of someone. I had a student one time tell me that his calling out of this boyhood stage was when the crocodile hunter Steve Irwin died. Because he got stabbed in the heart by a stingray. And for him, it was the first time he realized that life was fragile. And it's the first time that he realized that he could die. And so I think for boys, that's a sensitive time when they're moving out of the stage. You'll see there's an arrow that points back and forth. And sadly, a lot of what happens in life is that men just stay back and forth in that. They come out of boyhood, maybe they get excited, they're going to college, and then they realize they get to college and they feel very lost, and they get depressed, they stay in their dorm room and they play video games all day. Or they get drawn into pornography or other things that numb them to the world. And so then they'll come out of that, maybe when they get married, and they'll retreat back into that through just workaholism or sports. And so you can see men who never really leave that stage, and they retreat back to boyhood slumber. But the model of that, the piece of that I want you all to get is that it's a starting point for everyone, and they're asleep to the critical needs of the world, and the critical needs of the body of Christ and those around them and their family. And so for you guys, as you think about what called you out of that boyhood cycle, or that boyhood stage, I should say, I do want y'all to discuss that at the table, like what was the first time you were called out of that. But as you're called out of that, you start seeing a bigger world. You start seeing that there's more to this life than the cereal that I'm eating, Saturday morning cartoons, and playing basketball in the driveway or riding my bike. That world is pretty scary. And so one thing that this model shows that we try to institute as a church, try to work with families on, is a rite of passage, which McCurry's going to talk to you more about. But what's important in this stage, in any transition, I think JB talked a lot about transitions last week. The thing about transitions are that we face them in different stages of life. And rites of passages and ceremonies are really developed to help us walk through and usher through those times of transition. And so what I want this room to start thinking about is, look, and a lot of you guys are 20s, 30s, 40s, maybe a little bit up. But each of y'all are in some type of transition, whether it's transition into career and adult world. Some of you are getting married. Some of y'all are transitioning into having kids. Some of y'all are transitioning to empty nesters, and starting to reflect on that stage of life. I want y'all to start thinking about, how can I, with other men, create some type of community that goes through an intentional rite of passage or ceremony together to identify that transition, to talk about it together, and to mark that moment. Okay? So I think I've been wrestling a lot with kind of midlife as a 42-year-old. Hope that's my midlife goal. I'm praying for 84 or longer. But, for me, I've just started to wrestle with graying. My body's breaking down a little bit. I'm starting to see, my kids come out of childhood into early teen. And, there's some grieving process to that. There's some adjustments to that. So I want to get together with other men who are in that stage of life or in the other stage of life past me and say, how did you handle that transition well? Like, let's celebrate that. Let's mark that moment. Okay, it's not all negative that I'm going through this transition. God's given us this season for a reason. So we'll talk about rite of passage, but what that does, that's important in a boy's life that I didn't really have. A lot of you all may not have had. I didn't have somebody at 13 that said, hey, we're going to go do this difficult task, and I'm going to equip you for it, and you're going to go through it. We're going to celebrate that when you're done. So I want that for my son. We went on a hike last year, and it's pretty rigorous. And it was, part of this for him is something that was designed to be difficult but manageable, designed to let him test himself. And then we celebrated that. And so for me, I kind of agreed that. I looked at sports was maybe a little bit of that. But at the same time, no one was intentional at that stage. So I started asking myself, okay, I didn't have that at that stage. How can I create that in my 40s? So after that, a boy enters the training and discipleship piece. Well, let me back up real quick. I think a great picture, I wanted to give you a couple pictures to these. A great picture that call it to adventure stage. If you've watched Stranger Things, definitely as a youth pastor, that's in the middle of my world. There's a beautiful scene where one of the main characters, Mike, is a boy. His friend has been taken by a monster, kind of indwelt by a monster. And the girl that he loves as a 12, 13-year-old has gone away. And there's this cop in the show named Hopper, who's kind of the 40-something-year-old manly character. And there's a scene where he's yelling at Hopper, mad at him for keeping this girl that he likes out of his world. And he's basically starting to blow up and hit Hopper, saying, all of this is a bunch of crap. All this is, not fair. And he's hitting Hopper. And Hopper's just sitting there taking those blows. He ends up, beautiful scene where he hugs Mike. He's like, I know it's not fair, son. And it's just this powerful moment where Mike is feeling like he's coming out of boyhood, and he's in a tragic way brought in this call to adventure stage. And then Hopper is sitting there in the middle of his life. And if you know anything about Mike, if you've seen the show, I think it's great for manhood. It's the show's not for everybody. It's a little creepy in some ways, but it's a great show for manhood. The thing about Mike is his dad is this classic character who's always asleep on the couch, very passive, detached. So it's just interesting to see a model of that. But as the boy moves into the training discipleship phase, this is something I think the church of all of these probably does okay. We would all say as a church, we need to train our young men. We need to disciple them. There's usually a process for this in some ways that usually has some type of intentionality and endpoint. But this phase is not about just going through a Bible study. It's not about just being part of student ministry. It's not about just, for you all as men, learning things of the Bible. The thing about this stage is it's also about application. It's also about testing what you've learned and applying what you've learned. I think the military does this very well. If you think about this whole cycle, these young boys hit the military, rite of passage. They get their head shaved. They all get the same clothes. They have a drill sergeant yelling at them. They are kind of stripped of their identity, and then they go through basic training. They're built back up, and then at the end, they're celebrated. And we're going to talk about that. But the training and discipleship phase is one that we're probably most familiar with. But when you don't have the complete cycle surrounding this, it becomes impotent in some ways, because you have this information, but you do not know if you have what it takes to take this information to the world, okay? And so for me, I came out of college well-trained in ministry through a campus ministry. I came out well-trained in some ways, but I kind of muddled around feeling like, I don't know really if I have what it takes to go do this. Even though I've been trained in this, I didn't really feel like I had that pathway or affirmation from the larger community. So if you think about training and discipleship, another model might be, you see the model of Rocky back in the day with going through, I think about him, eating the raw eggs and chasing the chicken with, is it Mick, the trainer? Think about him in Rocky IV going to Siberia to train. He didn't want the fancy gym. And, you think about things like that, just kind of epic movie moments. But then he had to do all that because there was actual fight. He had to prove himself. So for us as men, I think what I'd love for this room to think about is you all are probably as well trained in academics, in the gospel as most people in the world. And I think a lot of what can hold a room like this back is that we don't get past our insecurities to go out there and live that out in the arena that God's designed us for. And so I would encourage you all to get after it, to go after it, to do it with some other men that you can encourage each other along that trajectory. Well, I think this is the biggest problem, this next stage, completion of the quest, the initiation ceremony that goes with that. I think this is probably where a lot of men stall. And a lot of men that I've talked to in student ministry, in ministry, would say, man, I didn't get that. And what that is you'll have guys that they go to college, they learn the gospel, they learn medicine, they learn accounting, whatever it is that they go into. And then they get to this phase and they feel like, well, I'm 28, I'm 40, I'm 60. I know I'm a man, but I don't know that anyone else knows that I'm a man. And so I think that's something I've wrestled with for some time, is that the completion of the quest is where you're finished with your training and discipleship. You're at a point where you're ready to take that to the world. But I think the thing that happens in the church today and in America is that because we don't have a defined process, is that after you go through that, there's no community that says, you've done this, you're ready, we celebrate you, we launch you out, we love you, you're great, go do it. We affirm you as a man. So I think a lot of people in our body, if I had to survey this room, would probably say they're uninitiated, unaffirmed men. They are men, but they're uninitiated and they're unaffirmed. And that's not your fault. That's the breakdown of our church, the breakdown of our society in some ways. So I think this room is probably at a point where you guys are probably, most of you, stalling at that point, or you've pressed on after that. You're going to this next phase, return and contribute. It's where the boy's ripped away from mom in the primitive tribes. He's gone through the training process. They affirm him through an initiation ceremony that he's a man in the tribe, and he comes back and then he starts giving to the younger men. A lot of you are giving to the younger men in our church, in our tribe, so to speak. But you still have that piece where no one's affirmed that. And no one's affirming that you're doing that. So I want to pause and just say, if you're here and you're giving to your families, you're giving to our church, you're giving to society, you're mentoring, you're coming back as a man to return and contribute, thank you. And I want y'all to hear that a lot of times you don't get that from society or formally from our church, or the church in general, I should say. B is going to walk us through an initiation ceremony. What's important on that is you come out of that completion of training, and as the tribe affirms you, the thing about ceremony is it really affirms, it really drives home what you just went through. So ceremony is there to really, I don't know what word I'm looking for, but it's there to really put a stamp on what you just went through. So I think as a body of Christ, I'd love to see us as men start to think through, all right, a lot of us are in this stage where we've been trained, we're doing it, we're giving to other men, but we've never been affirmed by the larger community of men. We don't have a place where we sit around the fire as a tribe, or we don't have cultural practices that really show this. I think some of y'all, this might have happened at your wedding. I'm a big fan of this for you that are walking with sons, not necessarily happening during a different stage where you would celebrate something different, like turning 16 or a wedding. Those should be celebrated, and Brian's going to talk about that. But I think this completion of the quest is great to be an offset, different ceremony where we as a community of men would affirm that and celebrate that. So that's this cycle. If y'all want to dive into it anymore, a deeper way, I'm here to go grab coffee with you, talk through this, nerd out on it, walk you through a little bit more detail. I've done this with students. Have done this with actually a couple of schools. We've been able to go and teach some of this. Have doing this with my own son and daughters. For you all in here that don't have sons, there's an adaptation of this that we can talk about for daughters. But I just want you guys to know that as a church, we don't want you out here floundering. We don't want you feeling like, man, I'm busting it as a man. I'm tired, feel unaffirmed. No one's thinking about me, caring about me. Like, no, we are. We want to celebrate that. We want to give you gas on that fire to go and be men. We need you. We've got tons and tons of boys in our congregation that need this tribe here. And we love you guys. We appreciate what you all do. I'd love to just sit and hear the stories of how you're doing this. And I'd love to hear the stories about on a night where you're going to bed and it's just kind of one of those days you feel empty and you realize, like, man, I've never really had somebody affirm me. I would love to dive in with you on that, talk to you about that. So thank you guys. Appreciate it. Thanks for coming this morning. Brian's going to come walk us through the importance of rite of passages and initiation ceremonies and what's what we can do to grow that in our lives.
Well, as Brian said, what I want to do kind of in our last 10 minutes or so, and then we'll have some table time like we did last week. I want to talk about the importance of ceremony. And just to affirm what Brian was saying, a lot of this, because our culture does not have normative ceremonies and rites of passage, we get the opportunity to create some of this on our own. And so don't let the reality that we don't have that make you not do it. Just make it on your own. Like Brian and I are part of a group of guys that we get together and eat barbecue and we watch the draft last Thursday night, or we'll go to a restaurant and hang out. Just a group of guys that are walking through life together. And even just hearing you talk about that, it's like, we need to create some of those markers for one another. So we get the opportunity to create that. So what is the importance of ceremony, and what is the power of ceremony? I'm going to reset the table here. I think young men, especially in that last week, we talked about that 10 to 20 stage. I think a lot of young men are asking, what does it mean to be a man? Do you become a man when you hit puberty? Do you become a man when you leave home? Do you become a man when you kill your first animal of some sort? A buck or a squirrel or whatever it is that you may kill? Is it when you have your first beer? Does it take a woman to create a man? Is that what ultimately calls a man up to manhood? We're kind of in a place where we don't have those defined markers and those defined moments in our current society. So we get the opportunity again to create that. I think when I ask the question, what does every man need, and especially every young man need, you'll see it up here on the screen. I think every young man needs first a definition, a clear definition of what manhood is. Like if I were to ask you that question, what is authentic manhood or biblical manhood, how would you answer that question? I don't know that I would have that apart from being trained, going through some of this stuff with our church with 33. But every young man needs a clear, inspiring, biblically grounded definition of what manhood is. That's why we do these things around these tables from time to time. And so we need to be forming that. We need to be able to rattle that off. I'll show you and talk more about this in a minute. There's a baseball bat up here. This is a baseball bat that I gave to my son when he turned 13. And on the end of that bat, you can see it up here in a second, is four pillars of what manhood is. And so this is a memento that I gave him when he was 13. And I'm able then to have a common language and to be able to call him up into those things. We need to have definitions, a clear definition. We also need a process. Brian talked about that with the cycle. There is a process. There is intentionality to this. Apart from just floating through life, we need to create those processes. And then ceremony, taking the time to mark a moment when a young man may pass from one season of life into the next, those transitions. So that baseball bat represents, like I said, I'll talk about that in just a minute. But there is power in ceremony. Think about ceremonies that you may have already experienced in your life to some degree. So if it was a baptism, there was a ceremony. If there was a wedding, when we did sports or band, there was an awards banquet. There were graduations. There were moments that were marked where you were making a transition from one season of life into the next. And those moments are significant because they're marked in a special way, right? You can be married at the courthouse by signing a piece of paper, but when you get married and rent a tux, and she buys a dress, and all your friends are there, and your family's there, and you buy a ring, and you throw a party, and you rent a church, that's a different moment, right? So we have these in our normal life. We do have these, but we don't have these in our manhood traditions. I think we need to create and start doing that. I want to read to you about how a young man became a knight. This is a book that I want to recommend. I'll give a few away today. It's called Raising a Modern Day Knight by Robert Lewis. So this has informed a lot of my parenting of my son. I think I told you last week I have a 17-year-old at home. And so this book has definitely steered me in a direction to be able to shepherd him and, in appropriate ways, call him up to manhood. But let me read this section about how it is that a man becomes a knight. Listen to the ceremony. Listen to the intentionality. So the candidate began with a bath as a symbol of a spiritual and perhaps as a guarantee of physical purification. He was clothed in a white tunic, a red robe, a black coat, representing respectively the hoped-for purity of his morals, the blood that he might shed for the honor of God, and the death that he might be prepared to meet unflinchingly. For a day he fasted. He passed the night at church in prayer. He confessed his sins to a priest. He attended Mass. He received communion. He heard a sermon on the moral, religious, social, and military duties of a knight, and solemnly promised to fulfill them. He then advanced to the altar with a sword hanging from his neck. Can you imagine that? That's pretty cool. A sword hanging from his neck. The priest removed the sword, blessed it, and replaced it on his neck. The candidate turned to the seated Lord from whom he sought knighthood, and was met with a stern question. For what purpose do you desire to enter the order? If it be riches, to take your ease and be held in honor without doing honor to knighthood, you are unworthy of it. The candidate was prepared with a reassuring reply. Knights or ladies then clothed him in a knightly array of a hauberk, breastplate, armlets, gauntlets, swords, and spurs. The Lord, rising, giving the accolade, 3 blows with the flat of the sword upon his neck or his shoulder. So he's getting hit with that sword that he brought down around his neck. How cool is that? And sometimes a slap on the chest as symbols of the last affronts that he might accept without redress. And he was dubbed then with the formula, in the name of God, St. Michael, and St. George, I make thee a knight. The new knight received a lance, a helmet, a horse. He adjusted his helmet, leaped upon his horse, brandished his lance, flourished his sword, rode out from the church, and distributed gifts to his attendants, and gave a feast for his friends. Let me ask you that question, a long passage. Do you think that guy knew he was a knight when he went through that? Was there any question of what he had been through that he was a knight? So I illustrate that to show that we need that intentionality in our manhood. We need to create those symbols and ceremonies. Memorable ceremonies are costly. They cost something. And it's not just money, it's time and effort. Even in that story about that night, there was intentionality at every point. There were a lot of people involved in the process. There were other people who were engaged in the life of this man. Memorable ceremonies mean a lot when they're costly, when you've invested money or time or creativity. And honestly, the more that you give to one of these ceremonies, the greater the impact. Memorable ceremonies also ascribe value. What you're saying is that you're important. This moment is important. So that's the value that needs to be expressed in a ceremony. And memorable ceremonies employ symbols. And that's what that baseball bat was. I did a manhood ceremony for my son when he turned 13. And it was not, you're now a man, because he's not. He's only 13, right? But it was the beginning and the embarking on this journey towards manhood. And so in that moment, in that night, what I did was we had this symbol. We have it right here. He was into baseball, so it made a lot of sense then. Something that meant a lot to him. On the fat of the bat here, you have this definition of manhood. What does it mean to be a real man? And so I gave that to him as a gift and a symbol that he can keep. It's still in his room. I asked for his permission to grab it out of there and bring it this morning. And in that moment, Brian Crenshaw was there. Others from our church were there. We gathered around the table. We had a special meal of barbecue. And those 10 men had written letters to Ben talking about what does it mean to grow in manhood and what would he need to grow in that for that next season of his life, for the teen years. And so it was lessons learned of, man, I did this well, do this, or I did not do this well, don't do this. And so it was encouragements, it was warnings, it was a calling up to manhood of, you're not yet a man, but you're beginning this journey towards manhood. In this box that I have back here, nothing special about the box. I got it at Garden Ridge. But in this box, really cool looking box, are all those letters that came from those men. And there have been times where I've seen Ben, my son, on his bed reading these letters years later. How cool is that? And so it's a keepsake, it's a memento, it's a marking of the moment, and it's a symbol where he remembers being called up into manhood. When do we need these kind of ceremonies? I think there are transitions that are helpful. One is puberty, around age 13. Puberty happens for us all at different times, but I think that age 13 is a good time to think about that. And for a young man, it's exactly what I've told you that I did with my son. It was a meal, it was other men, it was letters, kind of words of encouragement. The good thing about letters is that they're kept. If a word's just spoken, it's lost in some ways. So letter was helpful. And then some kind of a symbol. This is the beginning of an intentional journey towards manhood. That's the path that young men begin on. High school graduation is another time to mark a moment, to say, hey, you've completed a task that was in front of you. And if you think about it, it's the first time that a young man begins to experience unbridled freedom. And I think anytime there's freedom, it has to be matched with responsibility. It's not freedom just for joy and fun and pleasure. That's that boyhood slumber that Brian was talking about. That freedom needs to be matched with responsibility. And so in that moment, I'm not there yet, I'm about a year away, but with Ben, I want to give him a definition of servant leadership and accepting responsibility for yourself and for others. So I've already begun to think about that and look at that. Other symbols that I've heard of for this transition and this ceremony, I know Fellowship Student Ministries, they give an arrow, basically the visual that you're being sent into the world with a purpose. An arrow has a purpose, an arrow is intentional, has focus, and so that's one of the gifts that Fellowship Student Ministries give to high school graduates. I've heard of families making a plaque or a family crest, so that's a pretty cool idea. What would be your values that you as your family would want to pass down to generations? If it's loyalty or character or respect or godliness or a servant leadership, like making a family crest that you can hand down to your son, that'd be really cool. I've thought about giving my son a nice set of tools as a gift. When you're leaving home, you got to be able to change your own tire, fix things around the house. So it could be something completely practical as well. It doesn't have to be, completely symbolic. It can be helpful and practical as well. But a definition of what true manhood is, that's a significant time to get that. Another's college graduation. That's when a man is facing the world for the first time and having to begin to provide completely for himself. And so there's a call to manhood of saying, you need to do this, and you have what it takes to do this. The same could be said for if you're beginning a career-oriented job, if that's the marker for your son or young men. Conclusion of a military assignment. There are various transitions that are similar to that. And then marriage. That's when a man assumes a responsibility for a family of his own, for a wife, for his family. Again, it's that calling up and it's that affirmation of using some sort of ceremony to mark that moment. Brian mentioned the trip. That'd be a great thing to do, is take a trip together and talk about what does it mean. Again, I don't know it all. I can share things that I've done well and things that I've not done well, but to be able to pass that down to my son. So how do we apply this? We're going to circle up around our tables for the last 10 minutes or so. I think this should be a layup for you dads, right? So for you dads who are fathers of sons, wherever you are on this continuum of their growth, I would just say jump in. If you're looking ahead to 13 years old, you've got plenty of time to consider it, to think about it, to plan it, to lock arms with other men. That's the fun thing, is that I've been able to now do a similar ceremony with Brian's son, another Brian in our church, his son. We do this together now, which is a lot of fun. So we've kind of created a culture of this around our young men. It's really fun. So for you dads, again, a layup. That manhood is conveyed from one man to another. So do that with your son. Incidentally, my wife has now done this with one of our daughters who's turned 13. So she's created and done a similar thing with creating a definition of biblical womanhood, symbol, all the same stuff. So many of these same things apply to women as well. My wife leads that. She can lead that class. So jump in wherever you are as a man. All of us have the opportunity in the city of Memphis and in our church to mentor young men. The men in our lives need that exact same thing. They need a call to manhood. They need a clear definition. They need to know that they've been empowered to grow in that manhood. So who are the men in your life, who are the young men in your life that are around you that you could be a part of doing this, even though you may not be their dad? There's just such a void and a vacuum of that in our culture. We need that. We need the church to step into those places where that's not happening, and we can do that. And as Brian said, personally, some of us may have never experienced this. Like, you may, I never got that. Like, I kind of have stumbled through that and found that in later years through a community of other men in our church. But what would it look like for you as a man to circle up with 3 to 5 to 10 other men and mark moments of, man, you've just got a new job, or you're about to have a baby, or you've moved to another career. What does it mean for you now with more responsibility in your career? It could be a meal together. It could be a trip together. Just marking those moments and creating those milestones and those markers where you say, okay, I'm leaving a season of life and moving into a new season of life. It's just very affirming to have that in the lives of men. So what I like to do is at your table, we've got, like I said, about 10 minutes until 7. I'll close this up right around 7. I'd love you to talk about these things. So I'll put the cycle of manhood back up. But where do you find yourself on that cycle? Brian asked a couple questions. Where might that have been short-circuited along the way? If there's any place that you find yourself, man, I needed that and I didn't get that. Let's talk about that together. What would be next steps for you as you find yourself along that cycle? And then finally, what opportunities do you have to invest in and affirm manhood in younger men? It could be in your home, could be in the city, like I said, could be in our church. So let's spend about 10 minutes and talk.